The town of Ironwood Crossing was small, its dusty streets lined with weather-beaten storefronts and sagging porches. Life was hard in the frontier, but it was fair, at least it was supposed to be. Yet where there is scarcity, envy grows thick, and envy had found its perfect target in Evangeline Harrow. Evangeline was young, with a quiet beauty that seemed almost out of place in such a rough town. Her hair, the color of wheat before harvest, framed a face known for kindness rather than vanity. She had tended to sick neighbors when cholera swept through, offered bread to hungry children, and stitched clothes for families who couldn't afford their own. Her gentle nature earned her admiration from some, and bitter jealousy from others. But what truly set her apart wasn't her beauty or her kindness. It was the inheritance left by her late father, a vast stretch of fertile land along the valley. Land that meant food, water rights, and power in a place where survival was always uncertain. Every rancher, farmer, and drifter in Ironwood Crossing knew the worth of that land. Some respected it, others plotted to take it. On the morning of her wedding day, Evangeline woke to the sound of church bells, or so she thought. She had dreamt of this day since she was a little girl. The small chapel on the hill had been decorated with wildflowers. Her gown, though simple, was pure white, stitched by her own hand. Her heart fluttered with nervous joy as she imagined walking down the aisle, her life beginning anew. But as she stepped out of her home, veil in place, she was met not with music or laughter, but with shouts. Rough hands seized her arms before she could even cry out. The church bell was silent. What rang in the air was the sound of anger, men's voices bitter and cruel. "Today you'll bring nothing but ruin to us, Evangeline," snarled a man with a crooked scar across his cheek. He was Matthew Rourke, a failed rancher who had long coveted her land. Behind him stood others, men who had lost cattle in the drought, women hardened by hunger, and drifters who saw in Evangeline nothing but an obstacle to their survival. Evangeline struggled, her white gown tearing as she was dragged through the dirt. The hem, once pristine, caught on rocks and thorns, stained brown with mud and dust. Her veil slipped, tangling around her throat. She tried to plead with them, her voice breaking. "Please, I've harmed no one. My father's land is mine by right." "Your father's land should have been ours," another settler spat, shoving her forward. "Why should one woman live in plenty while the rest of us starve?" Every word struck Evangeline harder than their blows. These were the very people she had shared bread with, the ones she had sat beside in sickness. Now they looked at her not as a neighbor, not even as a woman, but as prey. The mob moved swiftly, pushing her through the streets of Ironwood Crossing. Storefront doors shut quietly as they passed. No one dared intervene. Some watched from behind curtains, their eyes wide with fear, but their silence spoke volumes. In a town where power shifted like sand, speaking out could mean sharing her fate. When they reached the outskirts, the path sloped toward the lake, a dark body of water fed by mountain streams. It was said the lake had no bottom, swallowing whatever fell into it without trace. Evangeline's stomach knotted as the realization struck her. This was no humiliation. This was an execution. The settlers bound her wrists with coarse rope, the fibers cutting into her skin. She stumbled, falling to her knees at the water's edge, the lace of her dress soaking into the mud. The cold smell of the lake filled her senses. Her heart pounded. She thought of her mother's locket, still hanging around her neck. She thought of the vows she was meant to speak that morning, promises of love and hope now drowned by cruelty. One of the settlers, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes sharp as a hawk, leaned close and hissed, "You'll not stand above us any longer, Evangeline Harrow. The earth takes back what it's given." The mob cheered in grim approval. For the first time, tears slid down Evangeline's cheeks, not for herself, but for the life she would never have, for the future stolen before it could even begin. As the mob prepared to shove her into the water, the sky above Ironwood Crossing grew heavy with silence. Not a bird sang, not a breeze stirred. It was as though the world itself held its breath, and in that silence, Evangeline's fate seemed sealed. The air was heavy, carrying the smell of wet reeds and stagnant water as the mob dragged Evangeline Harrow to the edge of the lake. Her once pristine wedding gown now trailed behind her like a funeral shroud, its hem torn and stained with dirt. The white fabric, meant to symbolize joy and purity, clung to her trembling frame as though it, too, resisted what was coming. Her wrists burned where the coarse rope bit deep, binding her hands before her. She stumbled with every shove, knees bruised and palms raw from scraping the gravelly ground. Still, she refused to beg. If this was to be her end, she would not gift her tormentors the sound of her surrender. "Hold her steady," barked Matthew Rourke, the scarred rancher whose bitter voice rose above the others. His eyes glistened with malice. To him, this was not merely about land. It was about power, about breaking the woman who represented everything he could never have. Beside him, a woman with a gray braid spat into the mud. "She walks like she's better than the rest of us. We'll see how proud she is when the lake takes her." The words cut deeper than the rope. These were her neighbors, her townsfolk. She had fed some of their children when the harvest failed, sewn shirts for men too poor to clothe themselves. And now, those same hands that once accepted her kindness pulled her toward death. At the water's edge, the lake glistened under a pale sun. Its surface was still deceptively peaceful, as though inviting her to surrender. Evangeline's breath quickened. She had grown up near this very shore, had skipped stones with her father when she was small. Never had she imagined that the same water would be chosen as her grave. "Any last words, bride?" sneered one of the men, his yellowed teeth flashing in a cruel grin. Evangeline lifted her chin, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Her voice, though quiet, carried strength. "You can take my life, but you cannot take my soul. The land you envy will never be yours, for greed poisons everything it touches," the crowd muttered uneasily. Some shifted their weight, shame flickering in their eyes, but Rourke silenced them with a glare. "Enough of her nonsense, do it!" Hands shoved her forward. Cold water surged around her ankles, then her knees. The weight of her gown grew heavier, pulling at her like chains. She gasped as the lake climbed to her waist, her bound hands useless against the current. Then, with one final push, she plunged beneath. The world became muffled, her scream swallowed by water. The white of her gown fanned out around her, twisting and wrapping like a ghost's embrace. She kicked wildly, lungs burning, but the ropes held her hands tight, dragging her deeper. Bubbles streamed from her lips as she fought against the inevitable. Her mind raced. Faces flashed before her eyes. Her father's steady gaze, her mother's locket now pressing cold against her chest, the life she was meant to begin that very morning. She thought of love, the vows unsaid, the future stolen, and still a voice inside her whispered, "No, not yet." Above, the surface rippled with shadows. She could see the distorted outlines of her tormentors watching, waiting for the water to finish what they began. The betrayal was almost worse than the drowning itself. How could neighbors she had trusted stand by so silently? Her chest heaved, desperate for air. The pain seared through her body. Her vision blurred. But in that moment of fading strength, she remembered her father's words. Harrow blood does not yield. Not to men, not to fear, not even to death. With a final surge of will, Evangeline forced herself upward, straining against the water, the ropes scraping her wrists raw. Her head broke the surface for just a heartbeat. She gasped, choking in a ragged breath of air, her scream echoing across the lake. It was not a scream of surrender. It was a scream of defiance. The mob gasped. Some staggered back at the sight of her breaking free even for a second, her wet hair plastered across her face, her eyes blazing with life. But before she could cry out again, rough hands shoved her under once more. Darkness closed in. Her body weakened. The cold seeped into her bones, and as the water swallowed her again, Evangeline's thoughts slipped into silence. She felt herself sinking, her wedding gown trailing like a torn flag of innocence in a war she never chose. On the bank, Rourke spat into the water. Let her be food for the fish. By the time the sun sets, she'll be nothing but a ghost of a mistake. The settlers turned away, some hardened, others haunted by what they had done. The surface of the lake rippled, then stilled, hiding the bride beneath. But the story was not over. For even as her life seemed to ebb, far in the distance came the thunder of hooves, faint, but growing louder with each heartbeat. The lake had grown silent. Ripples spread in widening circles, the only trace of Evangeline Harrow as she sank beneath the cold weight of water. On the bank, the settlers stood in grim silence, their fury spent, replaced with a hollow satisfaction. Some turned away, unwilling to watch the final bubbles vanish. Others stared, their faces hard, convincing themselves cruelty was survival. But far across the valley, faint at first, came a sound that broke the stillness. The low, steady drum of hooves against earth. At first, the mob dismissed it as distant thunder, but the rhythm grew sharper, closer, echoing down the ridge. Heads turned. Dust rose on the horizon, and then he appeared. Dominic Hale, astride his black stallion, stormed into view like a shadow torn from the earth itself. His broad shoulders cut a formidable figure, his coat flaring behind him with each powerful stride of his horse. Hale was known in Ironwood Crossing, a wealthy rancher, yes, but also a man whispered about in saloons. Some said he was reckless. Others called him fearless. What none could deny was that when Dominic rode with purpose, nothing stood in his way. He saw her instantly. The white fabric of Evangeline's gown, a pale phantom beneath the water. His heart jolted in his chest. He spurred his stallion forward, thundering down the slope, the mob scattering as hooves churned the earth. "Stop him!" Rourke shouted, his scar twisting as rage burned across his face. But fear had already cracked the settlers' resolve. Men stumbled back, clutching rifles they suddenly weren't brave enough to raise. Dominic didn't slow. At the water's edge, he swung from the saddle in one fluid motion and plunged into the lake. The icy shock hit him like knives, but he pressed on, cutting through the murk. His hands searched desperately until... there. Fingers brushed fabric. He grasped her waist, hauling her limp body upward with strength born of urgency. When they broke the surface, Evangeline coughed weakly, water streaming from her lips. She gasped for air like a newborn taking its first breath. The mob froze. The bride they thought silenced forever lived. Because Dominic Hale had defied them all. Dragging her to the bank, he laid her gently on the grass. His calloused fingers tore at the rope binding her wrists until the knots gave way. Her skin, pale and bruised, bore angry red welts where the cords had cut deep. He pressed his hand to her cheek, his voice low but firm. "Breathe, Evangeline. Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, the world swimming back into focus. Through the haze of fear and exhaustion, she saw him, the cowboy who had ridden into the storm of her death. She whispered his name, though they had never spoken before. "Dominic." A voice cut the moment short. "Enough of this," Rourke snarled, his revolver gleaming in the fading light. "You've meddled in what doesn't concern you, Hale. That land should be ours." "She should be gone." Dominic rose slowly, positioning himself between Evangeline and the settlers. Water dripped from his clothes, but his grip on his revolver was steady, his stance unshakable. His voice, deep and unyielding, carried across the shore. "You call this justice? Drowning a woman because you covet what her father left her? You're nothing but cowards." The words struck like a whip. Some settlers faltered, guilt twisting their faces. But Rourke, consumed by greed, lifted his gun higher. "Then you'll die with her." For a breath, time seemed to hold. The only sounds were Evangeline's ragged breathing and the restless stamping of Dominic's stallion nearby. Then, with the speed of a striking viper, Dominic raised his revolver. The crack of gunfire split the air. The shot missed Rourke's head by inches, blasting a hole in the bark of a tree behind him. Birds scattered into the sky. The warning was clear. Dominic's eyes burned with a promise. Fire any bullet, and it would be your last. The settlers shifted uneasily, fear unraveling their unity. A few lowered their weapons. Others stepped back, muttering. Only Rourke remained defiant, his hatred so thick it twisted his features into something less than human. Dominic took a single step forward, his revolver trained. "You'll not touch her again. Not while I draw breath." The standoff stretched, a fragile thread ready to snap. Evangeline, still trembling on the ground, pressed her hands to her chest. For the first time since the mob had dragged her from her home, she felt something bloom in her heart, not just relief, but awe. Someone had stood for her. Someone had ridden into death itself to pull her back. At last, one of the settlers broke. A younger man, his face pale, threw down his rifle. "This isn't right," he muttered, before retreating into the trees. Others followed, shame outweighing fear. Within moments, only a handful remained, Rourke glaring at them in fury as his mob dissolved around him. The lake grew silent again, but this time, its quiet was filled not with despair, but with the fragile hope of survival. Dominic knelt once more beside Evangeline, his revolver never leaving his grip. "You're safe now," he murmured. But his eyes, scanning the tree line, told her the truth. The battle had only just begun. The last echoes of gunfire lingered in the air like a curse. Birds had fled the tree line, leaving only the ragged breaths of men and the trembling hush of the lake. Dominic Hale stood tall, dripping wet, revolver still fixed on Rourke Malloran, the ringleader of Ironwood's cruel conspiracy. Behind him, Evangeline Harrow sat on the damp earth, her gown clinging to her, chest rising in shallow, desperate gulps. Each cough rattled through her body, but her gaze never left the man who now stood between her and death. "You think you can scare me off, Hale?" Rourke snarled, his scarred lip curling into a sneer. "One shot doesn't make you a hero. You've just written your death sentence." Dominic's expression hardened, his jaw tight as stone. "Maybe, but I'll take you with me, Rourke, and I won't miss the second time." The settlers, still loyal to Rourke, shifted nervously. They had come hungry for land, but now they found themselves staring down a man who looked carved from iron, a man willing to bleed before yielding. The mob's certainty wavered, their courage thinning. One of them, a burly man named Caldwell, raised his rifle half-heartedly. His voice cracked. "He can't stand against all of us." Dominic pivoted smoothly, his revolver glinting in the fading sun. "Try me." His tone was flat, deadly. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The air snapped taut. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a guttural roar, Rourke lifted his revolver and fired. The bullet tore through the air, but Dominic was faster. He dropped low, squeezing the trigger. The crack of his Colt split the stillness. Rourke's hat flew from his head as the bullet grazed past, burying itself in the trunk of a tree behind him. Chaos erupted. Caldwell fired, the shot kicking dirt inches from Dominic's boots. Dominic spun, his revolver flashing again. Caldwell's rifle tumbled from his hands as he fell to the ground, groaning in pain, his shoulder torn open. The other settlers froze, their weapons half raised, fear flooding their faces. They had expected an easy slaughter, not a storm of fire from a man who fought like he carried the wrath of the plains in his veins. Dominic's voice thundered over the chaos. "Who else? Who else wants to kill an innocent woman for a patch of dirt she never begged for?" His words struck harder than bullets. Shame rippled through the mob. A few lowered their rifles entirely, stepping back. But Rourke, bloodshot eyes blazing, refused to yield. "She's nothing but a spoiled brat clinging to land her father stole." He spat, his fury boiling over. "This town will thank me when she's gone." Dominic's lip curled. "You call murder justice?" That land was her father's sweat, his blood. "You've poisoned this place with greed, and I'll be damned before I let you poison her too." Rourke lunged forward, gun raised. But Dominic didn't hesitate. His revolver roared once more, the blast echoing across the lake. Rourke staggered, his revolver slipping from his hand. His scarred face twisted in shock as he crumpled to the dirt, clutching his thigh where blood seeped through his trousers. The shot hadn't killed him, but it had ended his tyranny. Silence fell. The settlers stared at their fallen leader, their resolve breaking like brittle glass. One by one, weapons clattered to the ground. Fear, shame, and defeat hung heavy in the air. Without Rourke's fire to drive them, their cruelty dissolved. Dominic kept his revolver steady, sweeping his gaze across the crowd. "Go!" he growled. "Leave Ironwood if you can't stomach living with decency. Because if you ever come for her again..." His words trailed off. But the unspoken promise lingered sharp as steel. The settlers retreated in fragments, muttering, their boots crunching against the gravel as they vanished into the trees. The moment they were gone, Dominic turned, holstering his revolver at last. He dropped to his knees beside Evangeline, his hands trembling as they brushed her damp hair from her face. "You're safe," he whispered, though his own voice shook with the weight of battle. "I swear it, Evangeline. I won't let them touch you again." Her hand, frail and cold, reached for his. She clung to him with the strength of someone who had fought death itself and found a savior. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, Dominic let the hardness in his expression crack. He had seen too much cruelty in the West, but never something that cut this deep. In that moment, he knew. This wasn't just about land. This was about her. Protecting her wasn't duty. It was destiny. The prairie wind settled into a soft hush, as though the land itself held its breath. The gunfight was over. The mob had scattered. And at the lake's edge, the world seemed to shrink to just two souls. Dominic Hale and Evangeline Harrow. Her soaked gown clung to her slender frame, torn and muddied from her struggle. Her hands, raw from the ropes, trembled as she tried to push herself upright. Dominic knelt instantly, steadying her with arms far gentler than anyone had ever expected from the hard-edged rancher. "You shouldn't move yet," he murmured. His voice was low, weighted with concern. Evangeline looked up at him, her eyes wide, glassy from exhaustion. For a long moment, she said nothing, only studied him as though trying to anchor herself in the storm of everything that had just happened. Then her lips parted. "You came for me," she whispered. It was not a question, but a truth that stunned her even as she said it. Dominic swallowed hard. "I couldn't stand by, Evangeline. Not while they tried to take your life for the sake of greed." Her throat tightened. No one had stood for her since her father's death. Neighbors had taken advantage of her grief, whispering that she was too young, too naive to hold land of such value. And now those whispers had turned to violence. Yet here was Dominic Hale, a man who owed her nothing, who had risked his life to pull her from death's grip. Her voice cracked as she spoke again. "They would have killed me. I thought my life would end in that water." Tears burned hot down her cheeks. Dominic reached for her hand. His was rough, calloused from years of ranch work, yet it wrapped around hers with a tenderness that steadied her heartbeat. "You're alive," he said firmly, "and as long as I draw breath, no one will harm you again." The vow hung between them, heavy and unbreakable. From the tree line, a few townsfolk who had once followed Rourke now lingered, watching in shame. Whispers traveled among them, of the cruelty they had joined, of the man who had stopped it. For the first time, the story of Evangeline Harrow began to shift. She was no longer a young woman to envy or despise, but a victim of injustice, and a bride whose savior had stood taller than the mob. One older woman, bonnet trembling in the breeze, stepped forward. Her voice was thin but clear. "Child, forgive us." She wrung her hands, guilt dripping from her eyes. "We let envy blind us. It should never have come to this." Evangeline's breath caught. She wanted to scream, to condemn them for dragging her into the lake like a criminal. But she also felt the weight of her father's teachings. That land meant nothing without compassion. That bitterness corroded everything it touched. Her answer was soft, but resolute. "I cannot forget, but I will not let your hatred define me." Dominic's gaze flicked to the townsfolk, his jaw taut. "You heard her? Leave her in peace. If you ever raise a hand against her again, you'll answer to me." The warning carried steel, and none doubted his resolve. The small group nodded, retreating, their shame-laden steps vanishing back toward Ironwood Crossing. Evangeline turned to Dominic, her tears still wet upon her cheeks. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk yourself for me? You could have stayed away, let them finish what they began." He hesitated, his eyes locked with hers. For a man who rarely bared his soul, the words came haltingly. "Because I've seen too much cruelty in this land. Too many people crushed under the weight of greed. I won't stand by and let it take someone like you." His chest rose and fell. And maybe I couldn't bear the thought of losing you before I ever truly knew you. Her breath hitched. The lake shimmered behind him, catching the last streaks of sunlight, painting the world gold and crimson. In that moment, Evangeline realized she wasn't merely grateful for survival. She was grateful that it was him who had saved her. Her hand tightened in his, and though her voice trembled, it carried strength. Then know this, Dominic Hale. You did not just save my life. You saved my faith in it. A silence followed, filled with the unsaid, with the fragile beginning of something neither of them could deny. Dominic shifted, kneeling closer, his shadow falling across her. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his touch reverent, almost afraid. You have my word, Evangeline. Whatever comes next, I will stand with you. Always. For the first time since the nightmare began, she smiled, faint, weary, but real. In his vow, she found not only protection, but a promise of something more. As the night drew near, the lake no longer felt like a place of death, but of rebirth. And though Ironwood Crossing would whisper of this day for years to come, for Evangeline and Dominic, it was not just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of a bond that neither time nor fear could undo. The last shadows of the mob faded into the trees, leaving only the hush of the lake and the breath of evening air. For the first time in hours there was no shouting, no gunfire, only the gentle rhythm of the water lapping against the shore. Evangeline Harrow sat wrapped in Dominic's coat, her once white gown torn and stained, her hair plastered against her face. She looked fragile, like a flower battered by a storm. Yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes now, a glimmer that refused to be crushed by cruelty. Dominic knelt beside her, his revolver finally holstered. The fury that had burned in him through the fight was gone, replaced by something heavier, something tender. He studied her as though afraid to look away, as though she might vanish if he blinked. You should have been walking to your wedding today, he said softly. Not this. His voice broke, the weight of the injustice pressing against his chest. Evangeline's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. Perhaps I was never meant to wed the man waiting for me at that altar, she whispered. Perhaps fate had other plans. The words caught Dominic off guard. He frowned, almost disbelieving. You mean that? She met his gaze steadily. You rode into fire to save me. No man has ever done that for me, not out of duty, not out of greed, but because you chose to. My heart knows the truth, Dominic Hale. Today I nearly lost my life, but instead I found the one I was meant to share it with. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the call of a lone hawk circling overhead. Dominic's heart thundered in his chest. He had faced down guns, mobs, and death. But this moment, this confession, unstrung him in a way nothing else could. He took her hand gently, raising it to his lips. Evangeline, he said, his voice low and rough, if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never know fear again. Not as long as I stand on this earth. Her tears fell freely now, but her smile glowed through them. Then stand with me now, not tomorrow, not someday, today. The word startled him, but then he understood. She had been dragged toward death in a wedding dress, her day nearly stolen. To walk away empty-handed would be to let them win. Dominic's jaw tightened, and then he nodded with quiet certainty. Today it is. By the time the sun dipped low, the news had spread through Ironwood Crossing. The settlers who had fled whispered of what they had seen. Dominic Hale defying Rourke, saving Evangeline, turning the tide of cruelty. The townsfolk who had once stood idle now gathered, drawn by guilt, curiosity, and awe. At the small wooden chapel on the edge of town, the very place where bells should have rung that morning, people lit lanterns. The light glowed against the dusk, warm and soft, as if the town itself sought forgiveness. Evangeline, still pale but radiant in spirit, walked down the aisle with Dominic at her side. Her gown was torn, her veil missing, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that she walked, alive, defiant, and free. The pastor, voice trembling with emotion, asked the question that bound their fates. And without hesitation, Dominic's voice rang strong. "I do." Evangeline's answer was softer, a whisper, but it carried like a hymn through the chapel. "I do!" The townsfolk erupted in applause, some in tears. For in that moment, they saw not just a union of two souls, but the redemption of their own hearts. Where cruelty had reigned, love had risen. As Dominic kissed his bride, the chapel doors opened wide to the twilight. Outside, the lake shimmered in the distance, no longer a place of near death, but the silent witness to a love that refused to drown. And as the bells finally tolled, Ironwood Crossing learned a lesson it would never forget, that greed may divide, envy may destroy, but true courage and love can turn even the darkest day into the dawn of forever.